Okay, so welcome everybody to this second OASIS Lunchtime Talk of the spring season. Today we have a talk, a talk on a topic that I think regularly comes up among the students as something that, interests people, the study of Japanese games. And here to give the talk, we have Dr. Joleen Blom from the COE here at the University of Tampere, the Center of Excellence in Game Culture Studies. Among others, her research interests include transmedia storytelling and Japanese games and culture, and many others. And again, she's here to talk today about the study of Japanese games through the lens of her stay in Japan last fall, by the way, which wasn't the first stay in Japan.
No.
Okay, but without further delay, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you for coming today. So yes, I will be talking about, the title is How to Study Japanese Video Games. Whether or not I will actually have told you that at the end of this presentation remains to be seen. So what we currently see, and what I think we've been seeing for the past 10 to 20 years, is a growing interest to research Japanese video games. And that is not super strange that this is a growing interest, because Japanese popular culture has been a dominant player in how and why our current, the way our current global contemporary culture looks like. And many who are interested, and I'm speaking very globally, not only about the students and the researchers here, but just globally or generally, many people who have been playing games one way or another, they have been in touch, they have touched upon Japanese popular culture, so video games, manga, anime. And this usually happened by either growing up with Japanese products, if you're born in the 1990s, early 2000s, or you learn about it later. So this was around the time that it really became mainstream Japanese popular culture. So it's not that strange that if you have a general interest to study popular culture or games, that you'd like to know a little bit more about Japanese culture. And the practices there and the experiences there of Japanese games. Now, usually when we see discussions about about Japanese video games popping up, it is usually Japanese role-playing games, because one way or another they have this reputation of being uniquely Japanese. And these discussions, when I say these discussions pop up occasionally, I think last week one popped up again, because there was this article on Kotaku, one of the game websites, that talks about how the producers of the Final Fantasy XVI do not really seem to like the term JRPG. And so what happened was, among others, on my Twitter, all these discussions on what is a Japanese role-playing game and what isn't, and how is it Japanese, started flaring up again. And the reason why I add that book to it, and I finally have my own author's copy as well, so that's nice, is that scholarly or academically, Japanese video games have not been discussed all that much, or at least not all that long, which is despite the influence of Japanese global culture happening in games ever since video games at least, became a thing. So for many of you and other people who are interested in researching Japanese games, it's often difficult to know where do you start. What is out there, what should you do, what shouldn't you do. And to do in this talk, I'll put this book aside, because that book is about if you really want to think about Japanese role-playing games in general and the discussions of what is Japanese and isn't Japanese. But what I intend to do during this talk is to give you an impression what it's like to study Japanese video games. So I'm not going to give you a talk where I gatekeep what you should do and what you shouldn't do, and what Japanese video games are and what they aren't. If you've been in my course on Japanese video games, you probably have an idea of what I think about this. I will actually teach that course next spring semester again, if in case you're interested. But rather, so there will not be I will not be giving you a checklist for things that you need to do. But rather I will give you an impression of what I do, for example, what difficulties I see and experience, and what kind of things I look for when I study Japanese video games, so that you might have an idea of what the study of Japanese video games could look like. And to do that, actually, I need to explain a few things about myself, because that informs not only my experience, but also the things that I struggle with, and maybe things I do not struggle with and others might struggle with. So I have a bachelor's degree in Japan studies, which I got from the Leiden University in the Netherlands, where I learned Japanese language and culture. And after that, I went to do a research master's in media and performance studies, which has nothing to do with Japan studies at all, at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. And here I learned about game studies. So until I went into my master's, I didn't know about the existence of studying games at all, let alone Japanese popular culture. And so there I tried to combine these interests of mine that I had in like games and transmedia storytelling and Japan. And then I did a PhD at the IT University of Copenhagen in games. Now, one thing that I would like to point out to you is that I was never formally taught Japanese video games or Japanese popular culture for that matter. I basically had to gather all of this knowledge myself. Yes, I did have a background in Japanese culture, which made it a little bit easier for me to have access to certain sources, but something like teaching students in popular culture was not something I did or we had at the time that I was studying Japanese. So there was also not really someone who could guide me in the topic. And so it took years to cultivate knowledge on Japanese video games. As Heikki said, my stay abroad in Japan from the past months. So I stayed abroad in Kyoto last year from August 2020 until this year in January 23. I had actually already lived in Japan twice. The first time was part of my bachelor's program. I lived there from September 2012 and August 2013. I managed to find an old picture of a 10-year younger me. And there I lived in Nagasaki, which is in the south of Japan. I studied, I received special classes on the language and on the culture. So that is where I was able to get a little bit more fluent in the language. The second time was back in 2018 when I did my PhD. And I was a visiting researcher at the Ritsumeikan University, at the Ritsumeikan Center for Game Studies at the Ritsumeikan University in Kyoto, which is also where I was in my stay a couple of months ago. This is the only lab in Japan on video games. There doesn't exist any other game lab as such, which might be surprising to hear for some of you. So I have these degrees in the fields of Japan studies, in media studies, in game studies, and I speak and read the Japanese language. I have a basis in Japan. So there's quite a couple of advantages that I have when it comes to, well, studying Japanese video games, because I have experiences from where I can draw from. I know where to go to. However, if you compare me, for example, to other Japanologists, so those who have studied the Japanese language and culture, who might have like a master's degree or a PhD degree in Japan studies or Asian studies, generally speaking, you will notice that my Japanese might not be as good as theirs, or I don't know about as many sources as they do. Or someone who has lived in Japan for a very long time consecutively, their Japanese will be much more fluent than mine. On the other hand, I did learn academic Japanese in terms of reading. It just takes me a lot of time. And as a result of my combination of fields, I usually have a very good overview of what is happening in game studies and what is happening in Japan studies and how these two can be combined. I'll discuss that a little bit more in detail in a bit. Now, that's all very nice, what I have, but I don't really think that you necessarily need all of these qualities. You really don't need a degree in a bachelor's, master's, or PhD in Japan studies or Asian studies. You do not need a high fluency in Japanese. N1 and N2 refers to the certificates that you can in Japanese. Mine should be about N2, but my vocabulary isn't great. N1, why even bother getting a higher one? That's like very weird words you will learn there. You don't need to have Japanese heritage. You can be white and study Japanese video games. You do not have to have lived in Japan. You do not even have to have been there. And I do not think you need to have played over 100 Japanese games or seen 100 anime or read 100 manga. It could help you. It could. It could definitely help you with navigating your research easier and with less struggles. But these things also take a lot of time to develop. It's not as if you start tomorrow that you'll be done with this at the end of the week. You know, this is going to take years, and I'm still trying to develop this, and I'm constantly figuring things out. So rather, when I'm, for example, looking at articles on Japanese video games, or I have to review them, or I have to correct them, what I look for is rather quality, consistency, thoroughness. And usually it means that I look for if people have done their homework, to become familiar with the topics that they're discussing, so that they will not fall into certain pitfalls that usually comes with the topic of Asian studies, you know, the so-called exotic countries, because that exoticism and that Orientalism is usually a problem. But I think that this applies to every type of research that people do in all kinds of topics. But whenever there are struggles or issues that I see when people want to discuss Japanese video games, and it's not necessarily because there's not a lot of work out there, though it's growing. Usually when I see an issue arising is because I see a clash in the understanding of the connection between the fields of game studies and Japan studies. I think when you are studying Japanese video games, you're operating on both fields. And the main issue is usually that these fields are not very aware of each other, and they tend to ignore each other. So for example, Japan studies tends to pay whenever someone is in Japan studies and they study popular Japanese culture, they tend to focus a lot on manga and anime. And so they don't really understand necessarily how games work, which is, you can treat them as a text, I do that too, but there is something, a couple of different things about games that I do not think that I have to explain to the audience here. But game studies, on the other hand, tends to concentrate on games and game cultures that are created or translated for and by native English-speaking audiences, and they tend to relegate Japanese games to the periphery. And then tend to repeat stereotypes. This is what a Japanese game is, this is what Japan is, this is what Japanese popular culture must be like. And that is a little bit too bad, I think, because the fields have a huge potential to operate together in order to enrich our understanding of both global, so how Japanese games work globally, but also how we understand Japanese games globally, and the regional phenomena of popular culture, so more like Japanese games within the region of East Asia or within Japan, for example. I do have a list of pitfalls. So usually when people do fall in certain pitfalls, or when we have issues, there is this tendency, and I'm talking very broadly about, no one is specific here, no article is specific here, things that I see on Twitter, things that I read about. Usually, what you see a lot is that people might not know about issues discussed in Japan studies. So I'm specifically talking about game studies here. Usually when you talk about a certain topic in Japanese video games, the popular topics currently are like gender, queerness, sexuality, political discourses, propaganda, or Japan's colonial past. They tend to, you enter an existing discourse that is already there in Japan studies, that a lot of research already has been done about within Japan studies. But articles then tend to not acknowledge that fact. So it doesn't become clear what the articles are actually contributing, not even within game studies. Within game studies, they might say, has not been researched before. I'm like, it has, just not the way, just you haven't done your homework there. Or scholars tend to ignore the topics. And that is such a shame because often these topics are available in English. They might be written by scholars of Japan studies in English, or they might have been translated versions of Japanese scholars, or the Japanese scholars themselves actually have written in English. So it's a shame to ignore that. What also happens is that the games that you do use then for your article, or the articles that I see that use specific games, they do not acknowledge that these games were actually already translated and carefully selected. So many games in Japan, they do not end up actually being translated and being imported overseas. This does happen more regularly, so more and more games from Japan are being translated and transported overseas to us, to North America, to other countries and continents. But there is still a whole lot of Japanese video games that do not get translated for multiple reasons. And so games that we see here have been carefully selected. They have been carefully marketed to a Euro-American market. And you might want to make note of that filter, even if it's only mentally. You do not necessarily have to constantly address that in an article, because it informs what we think is a Japanese video game and what we think is not a Japanese video game. There's always this beautiful example of the Soul series, not the Soul series, the Elden Ring, for example. Is the Elden Ring a Japanese video game? I leave that up a little bit in the air, but the fact that we're discussing whether or not it is Japanese, I already find that very interesting, because it says more about us than it says about the Japaneseness of that video game. And then there are these assumptions about the uniqueness. This is connected to about what I just said. These assumptions about the uniqueness of Japanese culture and the stereotypes of that culture. So there's this 400-year-old discourse of dividing cultural products between Western and Japanese. So we're talking about art. We're talking about products that we've been using. We're talking about clothing. When you start talking about Japanese video games, you're not exactly doing something entirely new. You're already part of that 400-year-old discourse. And so that discussion of Japaneseness or Asianness and what we think we are is so old that frankly at points it's just boring. And again, because it often doesn't say anything about the Japaneseness of things, it often says more about us. So there's all these pitfalls, and that is difficult to navigate. So then, how might we want to study Japanese video games? And the answer is not really nice. There's not one way. There are many different ways. I have a particular way, my own way, but there are also other scholars who have their kind of way. And most of us are, to be honest, still figuring things out, because it's a growing field. It's a relatively new field. Recently, I see terms popping up such as Japanese video game studies, or Japanese game studies, or Japanese media studies. We're still not there yet that there's something like a concrete field. That doesn't really exist yet. So most of us are still figuring things out. So instead of giving you this checklist, what I want to use my research today abroad for is to give you examples of what I do when I study Japanese video games, things that I'm interested in when I look for a Japanese video game, or when I'm researching that idea of a Japanese video game. Before I went to Japan, I got this funding, a mobility funding, in order to go by the Academy of Finland. And I applied for a year. I spent there 6 months. I had cut it up in 2 periods, and I will actually return again in August this year. There I stayed at the Ritsumeikon Center for Game Studies at the Ritsumeikon University. So that was the same group that where I went to 5 years ago. When I say I was actually joined by Elina here, who we went together, though it was more of a coincidence. We figured out at the same time, or we figured out that we would be going at the same time. So from that point on, we started planning together. So a lot of things that I will show you, she was also involved there one way or another. Hence the pictures. That you're actually on all my pictures when it comes with other people. Anyway, my current research is on parasocial relationships with game characters, where I try to explain why people have such a desire to buy these game characters in game. Why are we constantly interested in buying cute characters like in Genshin Impact? Even though we do not necessarily need these characters to buy these characters in order to play that game at all. And one way of me trying to come up with an answer to that, because it's a very big question, is by looking at digital games and video games from the East Asian region. So in that case, I mean China, South Korea, and Japan, with specifically a focus on Japan. And so I looked then at the global influence of Japanese cross-media marketing strategies within East Asia, and what kind of impact they then have on Euro-American popular culture. And when I mean cross-media, like my main focus is games, but I also look at manga, anime, products that are related to it. And so in practice, this usually means that I conduct close readings and ethnographies, so player studies on the role of fictional characters in game monetization models nowadays, to understand why people are so interested in spending money on digital games. At least that's one of the things that I do. And I published a couple of articles on that, or they are in the process of being published, such as the free-to-play monetization in Genshin Impact. I also talked about the character training of Animal Crossing. You know, when the pandemic broke out, one of the things, the game that really became very quickly very popular was Animal Crossing New Horizons. And then players started scamming each other in order to get cute characters on their island within the game, even though these characters do not necessarily, in terms of gameplay, add a whole lot. But that is what people did, and I try to explain that. And I've also been publishing on Japanese role-playing games in this Japanese role-playing games book. So, but also topics that I'm working on is like gacha games. So Genshin Impact is a gacha game. Voice actors in Genshin Impact, because voice actors are also something that is huge when it comes to popular Japanese culture. I'm talking about dating simulators. I'm talking about Pikachu papers. I write about Pikachu. And about lifestyle software on the Nintendo DS. I've also written a book, Video Game Characters and Transmedia Storytelling. And though that might not necessarily immediately be connected to Japanese video games superficially, inside this book, what I try to do is explain the theory behind game characters in popular culture within Europe and the United States or North America, which relies more on this idea of narrative continuity. So it has to be the same character all the time. If you look at Marvel, for example, with all the characters there, that whenever a character appears in one movie, it has to be the same character in another movie. It has to make consequential sense. But I also look at theory on characters from Japan, which relies more on character proliferation. So it doesn't really matter whether or not the character actually makes sense sequentially, if it appears in a manga and in an anime and then in a game, or game, manga, anime. but rather that it's there, so that it's recognizable and so that people want to buy the products there. Now, the difficulty when you study mostly texts, so mostly the products itself, when you do that like me, is that the majority of it can be done outside of Japan. But there's still a couple of reasons why you might want to go there. In my case, I wanted mostly to gather resources. I wanted to have access to books and games that I otherwise have very little access to, or wouldn't even know that they would exist if I wasn't there. Another thing was that I wanted to improve my Japanese. Yes, I speak Japanese, but when I'm here, I maybe at most speak it once a month, if I'm lucky. So it is quite nice to go there and to have to apply it, and also to learn the terms that are related, for example, to your research, and being able to use them and recognize them. Another thing is that because there's only one game lab in Japan, I wanted to meet other game scholars who are also studying Japanese games. Usually when you're trying to figure out how to do certain things, it might be that another person already knows how to do that, or they might understand the problem, or they have the problem as well, and so you can discuss that together. Or maybe they have like certain ideas that you have too, and then you can work together on that. So it's very useful to meet with these scholars. And then there are also just trends that I want to discover. It's one thing to discover a trend when you're online. It's another thing to actually walk around in the culture itself and discover, oh, I guess Genshin Impact is popular here as well. And that you see all the types of goods and products that related to that game or to that franchise are being sold. But other reasons you might want to go if you're not me. Maybe you want to do a talk or an interview or talks. You might want to do an ethnography within Japan. You might want to interview Japanese players, if that is possible. You might want to talk to Japanese designers or developers, which is another difficulty actually to do. Because often developers and designers in Japan are not very open to researchers. So it's a bit hard to establish a connection with them. This is an issue that even Japanese game scholars have themselves. And so it's not even necessarily about your Japanese being good enough. It is also just being able to talk with them. But you could also, maybe you also want to go to local events, conferences, Comic-Cats, these kind of like very, or indie games within Japan that you might want to go and see what's out there, just so that you get an impression of it that you otherwise would not get here. And this is also the hardest thing to explain actually if you want funding. Like I want to go there to see what's there. Now, when I went to Japan, I managed to get most of those things that I just mentioned done. But it doesn't mean that there's no struggle for time or energy, or that there are no problems when you go there. It's not like you go there and you see everything. One of the issues that I had when entering Japan was that, well, we entered Japan during COVID times. Japan is very strict on entering. So until April 2022, Japan was closed off. No one could enter. And then they opened up again, only for visas. So you could only enter if you had a visa, which meant that the embassy was overworked, overcrowded, visas were delayed. You also needed 3 vaccination shots, which was not really difficult to get in Finland. You needed a negative COVID test, and that one was one of my main concerns when entering Japan, because I had gotten COVID at the beginning of May. I still tested positive until the end of June, and even though I wasn't sick anymore, but that doesn't matter to the Japanese administration. You have to be negative. So that was an issue that gave me a lot of stress, because I was bound to leave August 1st. So I had a month in order to be not negative or not positive anymore. Then we also had this problematic situation when it comes to transferring airports. So I made the choice of transferring at Amsterdam for personal reasons. You can go immediately towards Japan from Finland, but you have to go to Tokyo. And I went to Kyoto, which is, you know, much more towards the south. It's in the middle of Japan. So one way or another, I had to transfer. I chose Amsterdam, but the situation at Amsterdam airport wasn't great. Everyone basically lost their luggage. There were like these huge amount of luggages that you constantly saw. And so I was currently like worried about, well, losing my suitcases. For those of you who have seen me, like who were like part of my Japanese video games course, that was also something that I did at the time online. So that unfortunately meant like less time for me to do my research, though, you know, it was really fun to create the course, to do the course. I was also writing my book. I was also revising my articles. So that's time constraints. And yet, I think we managed to, and when I say me and we, I think Elina and I managed to do quite a lot of things. What you see, for example, on the pictures here, we went to Bit Summit, which is a local event in Kyoto. It's an indie game event. And not only video game developers and designers from Japan gather there, also from other East Asian countries. And if they managed to get in, then there were also like a couple of like European and American developers. I think Finland was represented, or were they? There was a game by Finland, but no Finnish people. So they were semi-represented. We also went to the Replaying Japan conference in August, where we had this poster on food in Japanese video games, or Japanese food in video games. We're still finding out which one it is exactly is. But that's part of the research. We went to bookstores to see what's going on. We went to like these popular cultural stores. Animate, for example, is a very big store that has like fan magazines, for example, but also manga and other products on popular culture within Japan. There are museums that show popular culture of Japan towards like Japanese audiences this time. They were not really catering to foreign audiences because there were barely any foreigners in the country. We went to conferences, gave talks, things like that. And we also met several scholars. I would really like to introduce them quickly here because they are part of the experience. They're the ones like you talk to usually, or at least we talk to usually and discuss topics. So we had like people like Chloe Pabert in the heart, Kathy Newgan, if I pronounce her name correct, Keita Moore, and Vincenzo Casone. So these were like visiting scholars at the time when we were there as well. That said, to give you a couple of more concrete examples of things that I did when it comes to studying Japanese video games. I have three. One of the things that I did there for my research was that I bought a tablet and I downloaded all these gacha games from the Japanese Google Play Store. I could have done that within Finland, but where's the fun in that? Also, by walking through Japan and seeing what's in, what is trending, that also kind of gives you an idea of what games do I actually want to download. Because gacha games, there are like thousands of them, and so you just see something. But by walking around, you're like, okay, I guess Uma Musume Pretty Derby is very popular, which is this game on the right. I played it for 2 weeks and I hate everything about it. It's about horse girls that you can on a horse track that you do races with, and the gacha system is so that you'll get like new horse girls every time, and they might be better or worse. I also started playing Disney Twisted Wonderland, that despite being Disney has not been translated all that much. I think it's now also available in English for Australia and North America, but not for like Europe yet. So I played it in Japan because what they usually do is that you have these these events going on in the game itself, and then when the game is being translated, these events happen later in the other countries. This is a game that's much more popular under women, while Uma Musume Pretty Derby will get more money because the players are mostly young men in their 30s with more money, and women tend to like pay less money for these games. It gives us a better impression of how these games also attract different kinds of demographics. And I do that, and I look at these games mostly because I've been playing Genshin Impact for my research the past 2 years, and that is heavily inspired by Japanese popular culture. It is not a Japanese game in that sense. It's not created by Japanese developers, it's created in China. And they're using all these signals and all these aesthetics of Japanese popular culture. They're using gacha as the monetization system. So in that sense, I'm interested in what is it that then Japan does that gets picked up by all these other companies and gets even picked up globally and brought to us. I also realized I didn't really explain to you what gacha is. And so gacha games, the gacha itself comes from gachapon. This is a gachapon. And I mostly chose this because I think it's super cute. But what happens with a gachapon is you put in a gachapon is a capsule machine with a little ball, with little balls in there. There's like a series of things that you can get out of that. You put in like 200 to 500 yen, depending on how popular the characters are. And then a little tiny ball will come out and you'll get a character or an item. You will always... This is kind of what it looks like when you're trying to get one. Right? You will always get a character, but it might just not be the one that you want. So, and that's also how these gacha systems in the game itself works. You will always get something, which is why it's not considered by the Japanese government to be gambling, though they have like heavy restrictions on gambling. But it might just, you will always get a character or an item, but it might just not be the one that you want. And then you're like, I'll do it again and put in more money. Another thing that we did was that with all these groups of, with this group of game scholars that I just showed you, we went to the Tokyo Game Show, which happened in September. And I think, if I remember correctly, that it was the first one organized again after 2 years of COVID. It's the biggest game in Japan where developers from the AAA games, but also indie game developers, showcase their newest games or their interests. And here I went because I wanted to get an idea of, well, what are the trends? What are the current trends in Japanese game culture? And there were like a couple of things that stood out to me. There were very many raffles, so small lotteries. I tried to get like products from my favorite Japanese role-playing game, and I couldn't just buy the product itself. I actually had to go through this lottery, and even though you would always get a prize, you might not get the poster or the goodie that you wanted. And so I suddenly ended up like with a poster this big, and that wasn't really what I wanted. There was also the Korean game industry, which is not this, represented, mostly in mobile phone games. And given that the relationship between Japan and Korea, South Korea, is a little bit shaky, it was quite interesting to see that they were there and publishing and showing their games. There's also Cluster. At the time, I don't recall that we really understood what it was at the time when we saw this, but this is Cluster. This is a metaverse in Japan. I don't think this is related to Facebook. And I haven't seen this outside of Japan, to be honest. So I think it's very Japan specific. And there were also like NFT games. Discord was there, which was interesting because Steam is not huge in Japan. They're more focused on console gaming, mobile gaming, usually. And then there were also virtual YouTubers. There was a virtual YouTuber speaking about a game, and that was being broadcasted to YouTube. So that's not only people at the Tokyo Game Show itself could see it, but also outside. So virtual YouTubers are definitely a big thing and published by or advertised by the game culture from Japan, or the game industry from Japan. Finally, we went to Universal Studios Japan in Osaka, Nintendo World, because that was something that before COVID times didn't exist yet. I think it's relatively new, like maybe 1 year old, to experience how a theme park is gamified. And it was gamified quite all right already from the beginning in order to get your tickets. If you ever decide to go to Nintendo World, you will spend about €180 to get in. So make sure to save. So one of the things that we needed was we needed a ticket to enter Universal Studios. Then we needed a ticket to enter Nintendo World. And then we needed a ticket to enter the rides, or to at least have some fast passes. And then we also bought this ticket in order to actually be able to interact with the games here. So you can go without interacting with the games, but if you do want to interact, you have to buy this watch, this wristwatch. There, wristwatch in the middle. We also couldn't enter all together because they had a set time, and we tried to enter at the same time or at different times, and it did not work. Never thought I never did think it could, but you know, one can try. So once some of us were in, we tried different tries to see how they had like gamified the world. And I think two things in particular stood out to me. Now, you needed to download an app, so you also need to have a phone, which I suppose most people will have nowadays. And in order to use that app, you needed the watch. And by using that watch, you would gather coins. So you could, for example, touch coin blocks, or you could, sometimes you also had to jump, by the way, but this one was small enough for me to actually touch like that. And then, or you would have like, you would get coins based on your performance within the ride. So there was like this Mario Kart ride, and if you did really well, you would get a lot more coins. And then they created, you would get a score. You would also be put into a group. So I was Group Peach, that group did not really well in the scoreboard, to be honest. But you could also be Group Yoshi and Mario. And based on that Mario Kart performance, you would get more or less coins, and then you could see how well you were performing in comparison to others, how well your group was performing in comparison to others. You would also earn stickers based on your ride. So we finished first place in Mario Kart, but I don't recall if that was you or me, Eline. She used my watch at some point when I decided to leave Nintendo World, because after an hour and a half I had a huge headache and I couldn't handle it anymore. But another thing that I noticed was that there's also this Bowser Jr. game, which is like the final boss, the final game that you have to enter. And in order to enter, you need to unlock it. You need to gain 3 keys. And so if you do not have the watch, you cannot play it. And you had to go through these like simple mini games for which you had to queue quite a long time. And then once you played these brief mini games, you unlocked Bowser's mini game, or the Bowser's game, and you could play some AR game in there. So I would say that in every step of the way, we had to earn our way into the ride, into Nintendo World, into USJ. And it involved a lot of labor, I think, on our part, by you know, paying for the fast passes, paying for entering at specific times, paying for getting like the watch, then having to play all these games in order to actually enter a ride. And then you would constantly have to show off what your score is based on the scoreboard. So you couldn't really choose not to have that scoreboard if you had that watch and if you were using the app. So yes, a lot of labor. And finally, the other thing is that one collaboration that I did or started was with Kate Moore on lifestyle software. And that is something that maybe not a lot of people would think even exists or consider Japanese video games. So we discovered this Jitsuyo Softo, or lifestyle software, separately and individually already a couple of years ago, because when you go to second-hand stores in Japan for games, which there are a lot of, you see that there's like a lot of these like games that are not exactly games for the Nintendo DS. And when we looked into that, we discovered that most of this software is not only not translated outside of Japan, but they're mostly targeted towards women. And this is interesting because we see that games like this, I will tell you in a bit what they are. We see that they are available as applications, as apps on our mobile phones currently. But this was for a Nintendo game console, which was framed as a game console, and so the software is framed in a way as a game, but as a game for women to behave in a productive way. Now, games like this that we know about that were translated are, for example, Brain Age, Train Your Brain. Another one is Face Training, which was only shipped towards Europe, and so there you can again you see mostly faces of women, where if you put your face in a certain way, then you would train your face and would be more charismatic. Those are the ones that we know. But we also found untranslated examples like Anone on the left here, which is not necessarily targeted towards women, but it seems to be for people on the spectrum of autism, to help them with communication. Then there is Teku Teku Enjure Pocketto. And that one in the middle is a dieting tracker that helps you with like losing weight. And then the one on the right is Esse Kakebo DS, and that's a household accounting book. Accounting is a job for stay-at-home women in Japan. So it's usually like seen as something very feminine, hence the beautiful cover and design there. So these software kind of subverts our idea of what the Nintendo DS is as a game console. Is it really only a game console in that sense? If you can track your weight on it. But it also subverts our perception of what we consider to be Japanese games, or what we think the Japanese game industry is like. But overall, I'm still very much figuring out about how I should frame like the observations that I just showed you, or how I should talk about Japanese video games, how to frame these gacha games that I just quickly showed you, how to discuss the lifestyle software or Nintendo World for that matter. So in the end, what I hope you have seen here in this presentation, so I'm on the final slide, is that you now have a glimpse of what studying Japanese games could look like. That is not necessarily only about what is so Japanese about these video games that we see here. That it's not only about discussing what is so unique about the culture, which might not be the best framing, but rather that it's more about why are we so interested in the discussion of Japaneseness and the uniqueness. What is it like to study Japanese game culture over there, or what is it like there? What are the trends? How are they developing in tandem with global game culture, so influencing and being influenced by? And how can we place all of these examples in our current knowledge of games? Which I think then helps to enrich not only game studies, but also Japan studies. And that's it. Thank you so much for listening.
Okay, thank you so much for this sort of researcher profile and deep to the Japanese gaming culture. So we have a little less than 10 minutes for questions. Any immediate questions?
Oh dear.
Hi, thank you for a super interesting presentation. One thing that I've been wondering about is that it feels like there is a balkanization of game studies going on with these numerous subfields emerging, like Japanese game studies or queer game studies, black game studies, analog game studies, game production studies. What do you feel is the connection between these subfields and the main field? Are these strengthening the field by adding new voices and approaches, or are they fractioning the larger discussion into groups that are not really talking to each other?
I don't really feel that they're becoming more and more fragmented necessarily. What I think is happening is that you see really focusing their and specializing their expertise. But then what happens at the same time is that they want to reach out. They see a connection there, but either they don't know yet, or they're ignoring the fact that that research there has been done before. So there is, for example, not a lot out there on production of games within Japanese game industry, though it's definitely there. A part of it is because we're dealing with a language issue. There are some works in Japanese, but then it seems that is the reason that most people only can think of. Okay, it's only in Japanese, so I have to stop. But they don't take the step to then look up what maybe non-game scholars have done. And I think that is usually the crucial point, that you shouldn't stay within games, but you should also look at maybe more global Japanese popular culture if you want to answer those questions, or at least show that you have some idea of what's going on in the field. Because, for example, gender and queerness is like a huge topic in Japan studies, and yet most of the time I do not see within game studies scholars talking about that when they want to study gender or queerness in Japanese games. And that is quite crucial, because you tend to fall into stereotypes or to problematize things that either have already been said before, or already have been, where the discussion already has been like brought further, and you're just there trying to tag along, but you don't know that you're doing that. So that is what I think is usually happening.
Hi, thank you for interesting talk. And I have a question about, is there, to your knowledge, like an approximate percentage of like games, Japanese games, which are translated and ported? Is there like any data about like which amount of Japanese games are translated and ported?
No, there's no such thing, because well, I do not know exactly because why it isn't there, but I think it's because it's so hard to reach out to exactly know, and there are so many games and for so long, and some are computer games and some are console games. So perhaps there is a database that people know of, but it's not necessarily where there's like, this has been translated and this isn't. And even though I studied these games, I cannot know the whole thing. And so usually I too hear from other scholars of Japanese games that they know about that something exists, and then that's when you learn about it. So it's quite unfortunate, but no. Yeah.
Okay. Yep, in the back.
Thank you very much for your talk. I'm having a hard time thinking about how I can articulate my question well, so please bear with me. But it's something like this, like, all games are made in a country. So should we consider developing the same kind of intellectual infrastructure for each game that's made in a different country at the level that you're conceptualizing Japanese studies? For example, if I was to write an article about Alan Wake, would I have to learn Finnish and understand Finish's colonial past and all that kind of stuff to be able to write something that was kind of not silly about Alan Wake.
Yeah, I think I understand what you mean. So I think the reason why people like me, or maybe Japanologists in general, because I think this is a Japan studies question, for me at least, is that why would we like consider the background so much, right? And I do not think that you always need to consider the background of Japanese video games when studying a Japanese video game, if it's not like, if it doesn't matter, like for your research, if it's more like maybe you want to use the game to discuss another matter. But when it comes to acknowledging that there is somehow something unique or unusual going on in here because it's a Japanese video game, and that is usually what we see in the popularity of Japanese popular culture in general, then you enter this discourse of this 400-year-old discourse that we're constantly dividing something in Asianness and Westernness, and this has a big history there, and I think that Japanese video games are part of that history that we already have been dealing with. So when you then want to do something like a gender or queerness in Japanese video games, because that's the thing, right? You're not talking about video games in general, you're talking about Japanese video games. So you're acknowledging that there is something about that culture that we should talk about. The moment you do that, that is where I would say, then do go deeper into actually that background, so that you understand the issues that are coming not only from Japan itself, but also how we're looking at it. So it asks for self-reflection. Because the study of Japan studies is also a study of how we are looking at it. It's a study of Orientalism and colonialism, and I think that is where we have to acknowledge that part. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense. Really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Very dangerous. I'll destroy.
There was a couple of comments online from Luca Bruno. First of all, just praise for the section on what you don't need to study Japanese games, and our comment on the question regarding the percentage of Japanese game being ported abroad. There's apparently a growing awareness of fan-curated databases as a source of such information, but there's of course said that accuracy is very variable, but it's an avenue, for example.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, there are no more questions, and I think we have 1 minute left, so it's as good as any time to wrap up, and once again give a round of applause to Dr. Blom.
Thank you.